"Don't touch that guitar!" The words landed flat across the shop floor. No warning, no explanation. Just a voice from behind the counter, steady and certain. The kind of voice that had delivered that exact command before and had never once been wrong about it. The man in the gray corduroy jacket stopped. His fingers were less than an inch from a 1956 sunburst Fender Stratocaster mounted on the back wall of Caldwell's vintage Music Row, Nashville. October 17th, 1974. His hand held its position for a moment. Then he lowered it slowly to his side. He did not turn around immediately. He stood looking at the guitar. The body was worn down to bare ash at the lower bout, where a right-handed player's forearm had rested across decades of actual use. The two-tone sunburst finish had softened into something close to amber at the center and nearly gone at the edges. The maple neck carried the deep honey color that no production process since had ever managed to replicate. It was the kind of guitar that communicated its own history without a label, without anyone beside it to explain what it was. You either recognized it or you didn't. Ray Caldwell, 54, stood behind his counter with both hands flat on the glass case. He had not raised his voice. 22 years on Music Row had given him a particular kind of authority, not loud, not aggressive, simply immovable. Two session musicians near the front window had gone still. Tommy, the 19-year-old assistant near the amp display, had stopped moving entirely. "Stay right here." Because what Ray Caldwell said next was the moment he would spend the rest of his working life trying to explain. The man in the corduroy jacket had been told not to touch things before, never a guitar, and never one that had already recognized his hands. The moment did not begin in that shop. It did not begin on Music Row. It began 3 weeks earlier on a stage in Vancouver, British Columbia, with a microphone that told the truth about something George Harrison had been trying to hide since the tour started. His voice was going, not fading gradually the way voices do after long seasons on the road, gone in a specific, irreversible way, the kind that throat specialists describe with careful language designed to soften what they are actually telling you. By the time the Dark Horse Tour reached its 14th date, George Harrison was singing through the wreckage of his own instrument, pushing notes that no longer existed in the register where he needed them, holding phrases together through sheer force of will while the press filled column inches with words like disappointing and unrecognizable and a shadow of what he once was. He had kept going. That was who he was. Not the Beatle the audiences kept waiting for him to become again, not the mystic the music press had decided to find ridiculous, but a man who had made a commitment and intended to honor it regardless of what it cost him in public. Nashville was a day off. October 17th, 1974. The tour had no obligations until the following evening in Atlanta, and George Harrison had woken at 6 in the morning in a hotel room on Division Street with the particular restlessness that comes when a person has been performing for weeks and suddenly has nowhere to direct their energy. He left without telling his road manager, no driver, no assistant. He walked out of the hotel in the gray corduroy jacket he wore on days that belonged to nobody but him and took a cab with no destination in mind. Music Row in the early morning had a specific quality that Harrison noticed the moment he stepped out onto the sidewalk. It was a street that did not perform for visitors. The studios were already running. Session musicians moved between buildings with instrument cases and coffee cups, speaking in the shorthand of people who work together every day and have run out of things to say about the work itself. Nobody looked twice at the man in the corduroy jacket. That was exactly what he needed. He walked until the window of Caldwell's Vintage stopped him. Ray Caldwell had opened Caldwell's Vintage in 1952 with 11 instruments and one policy he had never revised. Every guitar in this shop has a correct price, and the correct price belongs to the correct buyer. He had learned to make that judgment quickly, not cruelly, but efficiently. 22 years of watching people walk through that door had given him a taxonomy precise enough to slot a customer into the appropriate category before they had cleared the threshold. There were collectors, careful, deliberate, asking about provenance and originality before touching anything. There were working musicians who went straight to the neck and cared about feel above every other consideration. There were tourists who wanted to say they had stood inside a real vintage shop on Music Row. And there were browsers, well-meaning, occasionally informed, who would look at everything, buy nothing, and leave the glass smudged. Ray looked at the man in the gray corduroy jacket and made his determination in under 30 seconds. Soft shoes, no watch, moving through the shop with the unhurried ease of someone with no particular reason to hurry. Nothing about the presentation suggested serious purchasing intent. Ray returned to the catalog open in front of him. What his 22 years of calibration had not equipped him to account for was what was actually happening on the other side of the room. George Harrison was not browsing. He was remembering. He moved slowly toward the back wall, past a row of acoustics on a wooden rack, past a 1963 Jazzmaster in its original case, past a signed photograph of Chet Atkins. He kept moving. Then his eyes reached the Stratocaster and stopped. He had first seen this guitar, not this exact instrument, but this guitar, in a photograph in a British music paper in the spring of 1959. He had been 16, sitting on the floor of a house in Liverpool, and the image had done something to him he had never found the right words for. Not want, deeper than want. The particular recognition that arrives when something external matches something you have been carrying inside you without knowing its shape. He had spent 15 years earning the right to reach for it. If you have ever looked at something and understood, before any explanation arrived, that it already belonged to you, leave a comment below. Stay right here. Because what George Harrison did next set everything that followed into motion. He reached toward the Stratocaster. Behind the counter, Ray Caldwell's hand came down flat on the glass, hard. The sound moved across the shop like a closing door. "Don't touch that guitar!" Ray Caldwell came out from behind his counter. He moved without aggression, without hurry, the way a man moves when he has done something enough times to have built a procedure around it. He crossed the shop floor and stopped a few feet from the back wall with his hands loose at his sides and the practiced calm of someone who has explained the same policy to 1,000 different people and has never once found it necessary to raise his voice. He told the man in the corduroy jacket that the instruments on the back wall were not available for handling without a prior conversation about purchasing intent. He said it in the tone of someone reciting something reasonable. Then he turned toward the front room and gestured toward a 1963 Jazzmaster in Dakota Red, a Telecaster Custom in near mint condition, and a small row of acoustics that he kept specifically for customers who needed something in the $3,000 to $4,000 range, fine instruments, appropriate options. The kind of thing a walk-in customer with no appointment and no stated purpose could reasonably be expected to consider. George Harrison listened to all of it. Then he looked back at the Stratocaster on the wall. "I've been looking for that guitar since 1959, he said. Ray heard it the way you hear something that doesn't fit the category you have already placed someone in, as an eccentricity, as the kind of claim that browsers sometimes make to suggest a familiarity with instruments they do not actually possess. He nodded with the patience of someone who has heard this before and moved slightly to the left to indicate that the conversation about the Jazzmaster remained open. What George Harrison meant was something else entirely. In the spring of 1959, George Harrison was 16 years old. He was in a music shop on Matthew Street in Liverpool with John Lennon. the two of them barely known to anyone outside a small circuit of church halls and local dances, playing in a group that had not yet found its name, or its sound, or any reason to believe it would amount to anything beyond the neighborhood. They had gone into the shop to look because looking was free. On the wall, mounted exactly as this one was mounted, was a sunburst Fender Stratocaster, American-made, the kind of instrument that existed in a different economic world from anything either of them had access to. The shop owner watched them from the moment they walked in. He did not offer to help. He did not invite them to come closer. He simply watched, with the particular stillness of a man waiting for something he fully expects to happen. They left without touching it. Lennon made a joke on the pavement outside. Harrison did not laugh. He looked back at the shop window once. He had carried that guitar in his mind for 15 years. Not as a wound, as a destination. The thing he would one day earn the right to simply reach toward without asking anyone's permission. He had earned it 10 times over by October 1974. And he was standing in front of it again, on a different wall, in a different country, hearing the same silence. He turned toward the door. Tommy moved before he had finished deciding to move. He had been standing near the amp display for the entire exchange, 19 years old, a year into his first real job, watching a man he had grown up listening to walk quietly toward the door of a shop where nobody had recognized him. His mouth was dry. His hands were not doing anything useful. He understood, with the particular clarity that arrives in moments where there is very little time to think, that if he did not say something in the next 3 seconds, the door would close and the moment would be gone in the specific, permanent way that certain moments go. "Mr. Harrison?" Tommy said. It was not loud. It was barely above a speaking voice. But the shop was quiet enough that it reached every corner. Ray Caldwell looked up from the catalog. The name arrived before the connection formed. Then the inventory began. The corduroy jacket, the dark hair past the collar, the wooden bead at the throat, the way the man had moved through the shop, the way he had looked at the 1956 Stratocaster, the way he had said, "I've been looking for that guitar since 1959, with no performance in it whatsoever." Then the way he had turned toward the door without anger, without a scene, without giving Ray Caldwell anything he could defend himself against. Understanding arrived, total, immediate, and followed by something that settled very badly in Ray Caldwell's chest. He came out from behind the counter for the second time. The catalog and the reading glasses and the 22 years of practiced authority had all somehow rearranged themselves into something considerably less stable. He crossed the shop floor and stood in front of the man who had stopped with his hand near the doorframe. "Mr. Harrison," Ray said, "I owe you an apology. If you have ever watched someone realize, too late in front of witnesses, exactly what they have done, subscribe right now. Because what George Harrison said next is not what anyone in that room expected to hear." George Harrison looked at Ray Caldwell for a long moment. There was no satisfaction in his expression. No performance of graciousness designed to make the other person feel the full weight of what they had gotten wrong. He looked at Ray the way you look at someone you feel genuinely sorry for. "You were running your shop," George Harrison said. "The guitar, can I hear it now?" Tommy found a Fender Deluxe Reverb amp near the back wall and set it up without being asked. George settled onto a wooden stool, laid the Stratocaster across his knee, and plugged in. He played one note first, just one, to hear the room. Then the room heard him. He played for 9 minutes without stopping. Not one song, not a performance, something closer to a conversation. The chord progressions from something rising and falling in a different key, the slide pattern from "While my guitar gently weeps" appearing and dissolving before it fully resolved, the open string drone that ran beneath "My sweet Lord" returning twice, the second time slower, as though the guitar itself had asked for it. The small Fender amp filled the room completely. There was nowhere in the shop to stand at any real distance from the sound. The two session musicians from the front window had drifted back without noticing they had moved. Tommy stood near the amp with his hands at his sides. Ray Caldwell stood behind his counter and did not move at all. When George Harrison stopped, the last note faded in the air of the small room for a long time. No one spoke. He stood up. He hung the guitar back on its hook with the same unhurried care he had used when he first reached for it. Then, he turned to Ray. "It plays better than it deserves to," George Harrison said. Ray Caldwell nodded once. He understood precisely what that sentence meant coming from this particular person in this particular moment, and he understood that there was nothing available in response that would add to it. George Harrison walked to the front counter and bought a set of Ernie ball strings, $3.50. He paid cash. At the door, he stopped and looked at Tommy, who had not moved from beside the amp. "You play?" George Harrison said. Tommy nodded. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't touch." Then he walked out onto Music Row and turned left into the October morning, and the small brass bell above the door rang once behind him. If this story gave you something, share it, subscribe. Every week, we bring you another story about the moment someone looked straight at greatness and did not recognize it until it was already walking out the door. George Harrison drove back to the hotel the long way. He did not mention Caldwell's vintage to his road manager. He did not mention it to anyone on the tour. That evening, he arrived at the venue in Atlanta for sound check and played the opening of Something Alone on the empty stage. No microphone, one small amp, 30 rows of vacant seats in front of him before the crew had finished setting up the lights. 3 people heard it. None of them ever forgot it. The Dark Horse Tour ended on December 20th, 1974 in New York City. The press called it the most disappointing tour of the decade. The people who were actually in those rooms remembered something different. A man who had already given the world everything it had asked for, playing now entirely on his own terms, at his own tempo, without apology. Ray Caldwell retired from Caldwell's Vintage in 1991. He removed the hand-lettered card above the display case, the one that read, "Please ask before handling." The Monday after George Harrison walked out his door, he never replaced it. Tommy Reese went on to become one of the most respected vintage guitar dealers in Nashville. He tells this story at the beginning of every masterclass he gives. He has never changed a single detail. The 1956 Stratocaster sold the following year to a studio musician in Memphis for $28,000. The new owner plays it every day. George Harrison would have approved of that. Some guitars are not meant to be kept behind glass. Neither are the people who recognize them.